Okay, so I will get started. We have kind of an intimate group here in a very large room. So I hope that you can all hear me properly. It might be nice to just go around and share introductions fast. I do want to make this sort of as interactive as possible. So I'll go first. Should have put my name on the slides. My name's Aparna Nair-Kanneganti. I'm a second-year medical student at Harvard. I'm really, really honored and grateful to be giving this talk today. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And I know that this global lens might feel a little bit divorced from the theme of this conference, which is a national health program, but I really do think that there are a lot of similarities between the movement for vaccine equity globally and the movement for single payer in the US. I also think that many of the same evils that we decry as members of PNHP or SNAP, corporate avarice, exploitation of people of color and poor people around the world, these are evils that were replicated internationally in bright technicolor over the past 2 years. And so I'm really hoping today to kind of explicitly bridge these causes. So yeah, maybe we just go around the room and share who we are. So
my name's Brian O'Malley. I'm a retired physician from Cape Cod, and I've been working for a couple of decades now towards a plan out there in the state of Massachusetts. And I want to point out that I think there is a real connection, and it's this. Forever what we've talked about is the absurd cost and the lousy outcomes. And what has become increasingly clear to me is that we're talking about an equity issue.
yeah.
Equity of access to healthcare as a right, as a basic. And more and more, I feel like that's the conversation that's driving why we need to move towards access, healthcare access for everyone.
Absolutely.
I'm Bill Joy, I'm a pediatrician. COVID-19 doesn't know borders. Problems with diseases.
I'm Vanderbilt. I'm a med student MQ from Wisconsin.
I'm Noel Watershed. I was an emergency physician, also public policy, and have been working on pharmaceutical policy issues for 40 years.
I'm Vanessa. I'm a first-year medical student at Stanford. And I'm Caroline. I'm a second-year med student at Stanford. I'm Jane Netfield.
I'm Leo Alonso, emergency medicine physician in Florida, and a PhD.
I'm Phil Verhoef. I'm a med-peds intensivist in Hawaii. Sort of interested in this because my wife is the state epidemiologist in Hawaii. So our dinner table conversation is a lot about this issue, right? Because it was her job to sort of figure out how to get equitable vaccine distribution. But I think in my broader mind, I feel like we have such a divorce between our public health system and our healthcare delivery system, and I think that's a fundamental flaw. And so, continuing to find ways to merge those things, I think, is really, really important. I think we need to understand public health better. I think public health needs to understand healthcare delivery.
And then maybe the person who came in, can you just share an introduction?
My name's Jack. I'm a second-year student at Johns Hopkins School.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started. I'll quickly just share maybe one or two things more about myself so that you understand kind of where I'm coming from and why I'm so interested in this. So I'm a second-year medical student, as I mentioned. I'm in the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology program. So I work as a part-time research assistant at Harvard Global Health Institute, but I also have a research appointment in the MIT Department of Mechanical Engineering, and my main research focus is the development of open source, low-cost medical devices and medical technology. So this is, vaccines are not medical devices, but they're medical technology, and I really, really care about this issue, and I hope that you all will too. It sounds like you all already do. Okay, so I will start with a sort of quick overview of what global vaccine coverage for COVID right now looks like, then hopefully I'll present some compelling arguments for why we should actually care about vaccinating the whole world. We'll sort of delve into the root of the problem. And hopefully I'll dispel some myths very briefly about vaccine hesitancy that I think have really plagued the conversation about COVID globally. And then finally, I hope to share some really inspiring examples of vaccine-related activism that have gone on the US side. For every US effort, there have been innumerable international efforts that I wish we could spend a lot of time on, but I think it'll be most constructive for us as a US sort of based organization to look at things that can be done in the US that have been done in the US. Okay, so this is the map of the world. It's colored by essentially the percentage of the population that has received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. And you can see that basically all of Africa is missing most of their COVID doses, while the whole Western world has been, vaccinated 1, 2, 3, 4 times over. And so, yeah, basically the state of global COVID-19 vaccine coverage is super dismal. And here's another very sobering visualization from KFF. Sorry, I didn't realize that it was going to be so blurry when it was projected, but hopefully you can still see the general trends. This line here represents low-income countries, and you can see that really only 20% of people in low-income countries around the world have received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. And the WHO actually set a target to vaccinate 70% of the world by mid-2022. So we have completely failed to meet that benchmark. Sorry, can you go ahead?
How much is it?
Whatever the weighted average of 80, 70, 65, 60, and 20. It's sorry, I should have just had a simple statistic for you, but not very much. Okay, so I think early in the pandemic, there was kind of this circulating notion that people in LMICs were not affected by COVID, right? They weren't dying of COVID. COVID is a disease that affects the elderly, and populations in LMICs are super young, so why would they die of COVID? But actually, this 2021 analysis by the Brookings Institution, you can see that the majority of deaths from COVID are concentrated in low and middle income countries, and the vast majority, the lion's share of the excess mortality from COVID occurred in low and middle income countries, which I think is just really quite sad. It's sad that we had this misapprehension about what was going on, and it's sad that this happened. Okay, so why should we care about vaccinating the world? I'm going to propound kind of 3 arguments here. Firstly, we know that equitable vaccine allocation actually curbs COVID transmission. So this is a really wonderful modeling study that came out earlier this year in Nature Human Behavior. The authors looked at the impacts of both equitable and inequitable vaccine allocation strategies on epidemic dynamics. They used a very complex model that integrated both COVID transmission dynamics and human migration dynamics. And basically, as you can see here, I don't know if you guys can see this small bump in COVID mortality rate and this larger bump in cumulative COVID deaths. That's what those 2 plots represent. Again, I didn't realize it was going to be so blurred. Basically, these plots represent, these rows of plots represent what is going on in high-income countries under these various vaccine allocation strategies. Basically, the takeaway from this is even if we were to just forget about low and middle income countries for a second, we vaccinate them and we forget about their outcomes, vaccinating people in low and middle income countries is good for people in high income countries because it curbs the spread of COVID and lowers the overall cumulative number of deaths that we would experience in a 5-year period. So that's sort of the kind of self-centered argument, but I think it's an effective one. And very similarly, these authors found that vaccinating people in an equitable manner also curbs the emergence of new COVID strains. So you can see that under the equitable scenario, all the way on the left, you're really only getting 2 strains emerging over 5 years versus 5 strains over 5 years in a very inequitable scenario. We also know that the COVID-19 pandemic has been exacerbating poverty all over the world. 116 million people have slid into extreme poverty over the course of the past 2 years because of the COVID pandemic. And forecasts from Brookings and other sort of economic think tanks predict that that number might not drop back to baseline for another 2 decades, which is kind of crazy. Okay, we should vaccinate people because it's better for residents of high-income countries. We should vaccinate people to stave off global economic decline, but also we should just vaccinate people because it's the right thing to do, because it's the only ethically justifiable position. Okay, so now some expository information, the least fun part of the talk. These are the most widely used vaccine platforms in the world right now. You can see that the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine is being used in 170 countries, and Pfizer is not exactly close behind, but it's the second most widely used vaccine available in 99 countries. There are also a few kind of like one-off vaccine candidates that are being used in very specific countries, like Epivac and Pasvac. But for the most part, most people in the world are getting an Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine right now. And it's also important to note most of these platforms are the traditional adenoviral vector platforms, not the fancy mRNA platforms that we know so well here in the US. And I will go more into that in this talk.
Wait a minute, Pfizer isn't the mRNA?
Pfizer is mRNA, but I think AstraZeneca just has such a large uptake in the world that most people are still receiving the adenoviral vector. Okay, so what are the root of these disparities that I've been showing you? I think really the crux of the problem here is vaccine hoarding. So on the left, you have a headline from a STAT article from 2021 that says we have enough COVID vaccines for most of the world, but rich countries are stockpiling more than they need for boosters. And I want to say that this has caused incalculable loss and suffering the world over, but actually a study last week just calculated the loss and suffering. It truly came out on October 27th in Nature Medicine. And basically, the authors did a retrospective analysis of COVID mortality under the current scenario in which high-income countries succumb to vaccine nationalism and bought up this whole supply of COVID, versus a full sharing scenario where every country in the world was able to vaccinate the same proportion of the population. And they found that potentially excuse me, I just want to make sure I don't say the wrong. Yes, they found that potentially 100 million deaths. No, I'm getting my statistics. 1 million deaths could have been avoided. I will fact check that because I really don't want to say the wrong thing, and especially not the more number than the one I used. Anyway, the point being, the mortality rate in low and middle income countries would be dramatically reduced in this full sharing vaccination scenario. And I will get the correct number for us. So why did high-income countries, why were they able to hoard vaccines like this? It's because of two things. One, vaccine pricing schemes are completely predatory, and two, low-income countries typically don't have inherent bargaining power at the table with pharmaceutical companies by virtue of being low income. They're just not able to negotiate contracts where they buy large amounts of vaccine in bulk and thus get these discounts like the US was able to do. So here's a chart, again, kind of blurry, it shows the agreed upon price in US dollars for these three selected vaccines, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. And you can see the AstraZeneca vaccine, perhaps you can't see, but you'll believe me when I say that the AstraZeneca vaccine is being sold for somewhere between $3 and $6 per dose. AstraZeneca claims that they're selling their vaccine at a not-for-profit price, but this variation in the pricing from contract to contract makes that a bit of a suspicious claim, I would assert. Yeah, please.
Sorry, what you said is accurate, but vaccine hoarding was only possible because all the public money that went both for the R&D and for advanced purchasing carried no strings.
Yeah,
So there was no demand for IP to be shared.
absolutely.
There was no demand for equitable pricing. You just gave the money away,
Yes.
said, go do it.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about IP. That's gonna make up sort of the bulk of the middle of this talk. So I'm glad that you brought it up as kind of a teaser.
Do you mind just sharing, like, the price of the others?
Yes, I'm gonna get there, yes. So the Pfizer vaccine is, bracket for a moment these two dots in the far left-hand side. I'll explain them in a second. The Pfizer vaccine is being sold at a minimum currently to the African Union for $7 per dose, and to the EU for somewhere closer to 25. These are current prices. At the start of the pandemic, reportedly South Africa and Botswana had quoted prices from Pfizer that were much closer to 30, somewhere in the $30 to $39 range per dose, which is actually higher than the US was paying at the time. Okay, $7, we're like, okay, at least it only costs $7 now, right? So that's good. Except that's not good, because does anyone know how much it actually costs to make an mRNA vaccine in the room? Does anyone want to guess? $1.25, that's spot on. The estimated range is somewhere between $1.18 and $2.90, depending on the formulation, because Moderna and Pfizer use kind of different formulations and packaging and whatnot. But basically, these companies are still starting to profit like $5, $6 per dose, right? Like their profit margins are still 300%, even though they've supposedly discounted their prices for low and middle income countries. And Moderna is really the same story. So Pfizer is actually selling a few doses at not-for-profit prices to COVAX, which we will talk about in a few slides. Moderna is offering a discount to COVAX, but it's not a not-for-profit price. They're charging $10 per dose. Okay, so I think we've established that vaccine pricing is in fact predatory. Vaccines are hugely marked up for really no good reason when we're in a public health emergency. Okay, so the WHO has launched several initiatives to help achieve parity, both in vaccines worldwide and therapeutics and diagnostics. The first is the ACT Accelerator. ACT just stands for Access to COVID Tools. And one of the 4 pillars of the ACT Accelerator is COVAX, which is a vaccination donation pool that I'm sure you were all hearing a lot about like this time last year. And some of the stakeholders who are involved in COVAX are Gavi, UNICEF, Gavi's the Vaccine Alliance, UNICEF, WHO, and CEPI. And then at the bottom, I've also just shown the stakeholders in the mRNA tech transfer hub, which is something that I want to talk about in a few slides. So that's just a quick primer. Okay, so COVAX, it's a vaccine donation pool. Great, vaccines will be donated. The problem is that vaccines are being pledged and purchased, but not delivered. So as you can see, more than 3.5 billion doses have been pledged to COVAX. Another 220 million doses have been pledged to AVAT, which is the Africa Union / Africa CDC specific vaccine pool. And like a third of those doses have actually been delivered to consumers and people who live in low and middle income countries. The vast majority of the doses haven't yet been delivered. They probably haven't even been manufactured yet, which is crazy because, as we know, we're like 2 years into the pandemic. And when Moderna wanted to initially bring factories online in the US, in New Hampshire, for example, it contracted with a Swiss manufacturer, Lonza. They brought that factory, they completely outfitted a whole factory and brought it online in 6 months. So now that their profit incentive has been removed, they're like really dragging their heels on producing and shipping out and delivering these vaccines. So this really just all reeks of pandemic profiteering. And just as a fun exercise, I want you to all guess what this is a plot of. On the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have billions of dollars. With a B, yes.
The profits for vaccine
So profit, that's a good guess. Does anyone else have a guess? So it's actually a plot of Stefan Vansel's net worth. Stefan Vansel being the CEO of Moderna. His net worth basically quadrupled near the start of the pandemic, and he was already a billionaire, so that he became like even more of a billionaire, which is pretty crazy. In another sort of addendum to this increasingly absurd story, Moderna actually sued Pfizer in August, claiming vaccine patent rights for COVID-19, which is pretty grotesque, as Tim Yearley of the group Global Justice Now says in response to the lawsuit. And the combined revenue, projected revenue for COVID vaccines specifically from both Moderna and Pfizer is $51 billion this year. Just to give you some context for that number, of course it's astronomically high, a study out of the Yale School of Public Health this year actually projected that for $61 billion, which is really not that much more than this combined revenue figure, we could actually completely cover doses for everyone in the world, mRNA doses for everyone in the world who has yet to receive them. So like that's 1 year's worth of COVID-specific revenue for Moderna and Pfizer, both of whom are now making other products and have other sources of revenue. And that could basically be used to vaccinate most of the people who still need them. Okay. So this is another figure from that same study. And I want us to focus on this plot, which is the 3-dose scenario, because we're all idealists, and we want everyone to get 3 doses of the wonderful mRNA vaccine. Because I do want to make it clear that this technology is amazing, right? Like we know that it's really efficacious, and that's why I'm at least so angry, right? Because everyone in the world deserves access to the best, not just to something, but to the best. So in the 3-dose scenario, assuming an infection fatality ratio of 5 in 1,000, which is 0.5%, so it's quite comparable to the IFR of COVID in developing countries right now. We're looking at these curves right here, and you can see that these authors used like a really conservative estimate for what it would cost to make the mRNA vaccine, somewhere between $5 and $10, which we know is already higher than what it really is. And it still only costs on the order of $10,000 per death averted, which seems like a very reasonable investment to me. Yes, go ahead. I believe they did, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not an insignificant number, but it's also, I think, a completely reasonable investment to make. Okay, so before I transition my slide, okay, what's the plan, right? Like, are we supposed to scrape together $61 billion, like 500 doses, donate them all? I would argue that that's actually the wrong plan. I would argue that sort of establishing this fiduciary relationship between a high-income country and a low-income country really leaves the door open for high-income countries to then go in and say, actually, we're making our donations conditional, or we want to meddle in governance matters for you, low-income country, or we have some imperialist agenda that we need to promulgate, or generally we're just going to be a bad actor and act in bad faith. So I don't think this donation strategy is sustainable. And actually, as it turns out, the sort of over-reliance on import of vaccines is actually quite a fragile strategy as well. Just as an example, we've already mentioned how the AstraZeneca vaccine is the most widely taken up in the world. And the majority of the AstraZeneca vaccine is actually being produced, or was being produced, by the Serum Institute of India. India is itself a lower middle income country. But basically, like all of sub-Saharan Africa that was using the AstraZeneca vaccine was getting it from the Serum Institute of India. So then when Delta happened last year, and Indian vaccine manufacturing ground to a halt, the Indian government said, actually, we need to save all these doses to vaccinate our population here. And that left sub-Saharan Africa completely high and dry, right? So we also can't rely on imports as a sustainable strategy. What we actually really need to do, if we're going to implement both decolonial practices and try to think about a long-term viable solution for this problem, is we need to set up local manufacturing in low and middle-income countries, right? That all sort of makes sense to people. But the problem with that is that you have to navigate this absolute labyrinth of IP. It's like a total nightmare in order to get there. And so I wanted to highlight to you some of the salient IP-related events on the international stage over the past 2 years. We're actually going to start way back before the mRNA vaccines came to market in October of 2020. In October of 2020, India and South Africa banded together to propose a TRIPS waiver to the World Trade Organization. Is everyone here familiar with TRIPS? For the people who aren't, TRIPS is an international sort of intellectual property agreement. And so a TRIPS waiver would essentially allow low and middle countries to produce technology related to COVID, whether that's diagnostics, therapeutics, or vaccines, without sort of fear of infringing on existing intellectual property. So this seems like quite a good idea, actually, given the circumstances. And lots of low and middle income countries were backing this combined India-South Africa proposal. It's no surprise to know that the US, the EU, and the UK were all in the opposition bloc, and that pharma interests were lobbying super heavily not to let this pass. And so the WTO did something kind of bizarre where they just decided that they weren't going to make a decision, so they tabled the proposal. So keep that in mind. Then on December 11th of 2020, the FDA grants Pfizer emergency use authorization for the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine. And 5 or 6 days later, follows suit with Moderna. So Moderna and Pfizer set up their like little factories and they have them turn out vaccines for the US and for the EU. Then in early 2021, the president of Costa Rica approaches the World Health Organization. And he says, okay, why don't we set up CTAP? CTAP stands for the COVID Technology Access Pool. And this would essentially be a tech transfer hub for all technologies related to COVID-19. And Moderna and Pfizer, when they're asked to come to the table to participate, actually just categorically decline. And they say, we're not going to reveal our trade secrets. We're not going to reveal our mRNA recipe, even though you're asking us to. Because we don't believe that low and middle income countries actually have manufacturing capability. We don't think they're going to be able to do anything with this. So why would we give up our trade secrets kind of like into the ether for anyone to use? Okay, then in May, Public Citizen, a think tank, publishes a roadmap to 8 billion mRNA vaccine doses in 1 year. So they literally say, here's the solution. Here's how low and middle income countries can make this. Their model involves retrofitting a lot of existing factories to make mRNA vaccines. It's actually quite feasible, and the cost is pretty minimal. Then Pfizer promises 500 billion doses to COVAX. Not very many of them actually get there, as we've already seen. Finally, the WHO realizes that Pfizer and Moderna are going to be of no help. And so they announced the mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub, in June of 2021. And in July, they tapped Afrigen Biologics, which is a Cape Town-based biotech, the South African Medical Research Council, and BioVac, which is a vaccine manufacturer in South Africa, to act as kind of this consortium for that will run the mRNA vaccine tech transfer hub. So then, kind of radio silence for 6 to 7 months. And miraculously, on February 3rd of this year, Afrigen Biologics, you might have heard this, it's big news, actually announced that it had managed to recapitulate the mRNA vaccine using the publicly available sequence of the spike protein. So this is huge. This is amazing. It's amazing that they did this work in a year, or less than a year, really, with no support from external partners. But it's also kind of ridiculous that they had to spend a year reinventing the wheel when this recipe already exists. And it's even more preposterous, they wouldn't have had to do that if the TRIPS waiver had gone into effect in October 2020. But at this point, the WTO has still not rendered a decision on TRIPS. Then in March, Moderna sort of makes this like incremental progressive step. They update their patent pledge to 92 low and middle countries. They pledge to not enforce their mRNA patents in those countries if manufacturers there are developing mRNA vaccines. And they also announced this plan kind of out of the blue to build an mRNA facility in Kenya. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what the potential drivers for that decision were, because it's actually quite interesting. Then finally, on June 17th of this year, the WTO adopts the TRIP ministerial decision. They grant this patent waiver, but it's exclusively a patent waiver. So there are 4 types of intellectual property, right? There are patents, there are trade secrets, there are trademarks, and there's copyright. And so basically the WTO said, okay, you can have your patent waiver, but you can still be in violation of all of these other things, right? We're not going to require that people share trade secrets. You can still be in violation of trademark and copyright. We're not going to concern ourselves with that. And it's only for vaccines. So the initial TRIPS waiver proposal was about not just vaccines, but also therapeutics and diagnostics. And the WTO gave themselves another 6-month extension to decide whether they wanted to waive the patent for therapeutics and diagnostics. So that deadline is December 17th. I should not understate the massive amounts of work from civil society, specifically in Africa, that went into getting this decision. There was so much mobilization of community-based organizations and NGOs. We have some colleagues at the Mbarara University of Science and Technology in Uganda, who were really, really active in this process, trying to get the WTO to finally adopt this waiver. So basically, if anyone should feel proud that this decision happened, it's not the people in the US, right? It's like everyone else in the world who was slaving away to make this happen. And then in July, Afrigen Biologics, the company that recapitulated the mRNA vaccine, announced a partnership with the US government, with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So hopefully that will help to accelerate their tech development process. I think clinical trials were supposed to start in 20 tech transfer member countries this quarter of 2022. I don't believe they've started yet, so I think they're a little bit behind schedule, which is understandable with all these obstacles in their way. Okay, so that was a lot. I also want to highlight that sorry, did you have a question?
I was just going to say that African signed agreements with 15 countries to take the technology as it's developed.
Exactly.
And then share any refinements back to Africa.
Yes. Yeah. I want to highlight that, just developing this mRNA vaccine is not enough. We also have to think about how we're going to store the vaccine. These vaccines are notoriously finicky and require cold chain storage. And that was sort of one of the early obstacles to adoption of the mRNA platform in most low and middle income countries. But actually, amazingly, in 2021, the South African company Renergen pioneered this cold storage solution that was completely homegrown. They call it cryovac. And they were beginning to deploy it in much of Southern Africa in 2021, which is really cool, and also I think bodes well for the future of mRNA technology in general in Africa, because as we know, this technology has, huge potential applications in treatment and prevention of infectious and potentially neoplastic processes, right? So we're not just thinking about COVID, we're thinking about what else can this technology be used for, and it's really wonderful that we have kind of a solution now for cold chain. So, where does the FDA fit into all of this? The FDA has continued to be a gatekeeper and maintain kind of a Western-centric status quo. And I will point us to a framework called the Mutual Recognition Agreement Framework. I'm actually going to try to follow this. And basically, these mutual recognition agreements are agreements between the FDA and foreign inspectorates that allow them to share and mutually rely on drug inspection information, which is supposed to help foreign manufacturers enter US markets. see here the list of countries that the FDA has these agreements with. And basically, actually, they're exclusively in Europe. Most of them are in Western Europe, but they're exclusively in Europe. And this is despite the fact that there is a wealth of rigorous clinical science happening all over the world. And so a few of you may have heard the story of Bharat Biotech. Bharat Biotech is an Indian biotech firm that made Covaxin, a COVID vaccine that they were seeking approval for in the US, specifically for the under 18 market. In August, the FDA kind of out of hand just rejected their proposal. The proposal was technically made by Ocugen, which is the American company. Half of Bharat, that's like a whole thing. Anyway, so this is just interesting because this vaccine had been completely rigorously tested in India, right? The safety profile had already been established in India, but for some reason those clinical trials were not good enough for the FDA. And so I know this is kind of like an inverted version of the problem, right? Now I'm talking about foreign vaccines and their use in the US, not US-based vaccines and their use abroad. But I think this really highlights, first of all, the extent to which the FDA will go to quash international competition, and it allowed, what it did is it allowed Moderna and Pfizer to kind of continue to dominate the US market and reap more rewards from their vaccine production. And as we all have heard this morning, they're sort of moving towards a commercialization paradigm where now these vaccines are going to be sold even in the US for exorbitant amounts of money. So yes, the writing on the wall is not good. Finally, I want to impress upon everyone that vaccine hesitancy has been greatly exaggerated. So in this Nature Medicine study, once again, which you cannot see the figure for very well, authors sampled thousands of individuals across 10 low and middle income countries and asked them what their attitudes were towards the COVID vaccine. They actually asked a very simple question, just if someone offered you a COVID vaccine, would you take it? And the results were overwhelmingly positive. Further to the right means a higher proportion of people said yes. And this bottom row here is the United States. So actually when compared to a control sample of individuals from multiple sites across the United States, people from low and middle income countries were overwhelmingly more willing to receive the COVID vaccine. So next time someone tries to say, people around the world don't want the COVID vaccine, you can tell them that's not necessarily true. I will say that vaccine hesitancy is not a completely apocryphal idea, but when hesitancy exists, it exists for a really good reason. And this is a cautionary tale, it's a bit of a digression, but I think I do have time to quickly talk about it, so I will. In 2011, as we probably all remember, the CIA was on this hunt for Osama bin Laden, and they knew he was somewhere in Abbottabad in Pakistan. So they engaged a local Pakistani doctor, his name's Dr. Afridi, who was working on a hepatitis B vaccination program in Pakistan. And they basically asked him to vaccinate children in the compound where they thought Osama bin Laden was hiding, and retain those syringes and test the DNA to see if Osama bin Laden was actually there, which is kind of a crazy plan. But anyway, supposedly Dr. Afridi agreed to this. He claims that he wasn't as involved as he's being accused to have been, but sort of notion aside, he went to the compound and he was given a phone number to call because no one was home to be vaccinated that day. And that phone number was eventually traced by the CIA back to Osama bin Laden. So through the actions of this doctor, deliberate or inadvertent, the CIA was able to triangulate Osama bin Laden and then send in their Navy SEAL team. And I'm sure, again, we all remember how outraged the Pakistani government was when this happened. And so the Pakistani government actually ended up booting a bunch of NGOs out of the country, including Save the Children, which was legitimately working on hepatitis B vaccination at the time. And so this kind of goes to show us that on the ground global health service work is super, super susceptible to these really complex relationships between governments, this complex mistrust that we continue to foment. It's not like some legacy of colonialism or like historical mistrust. This happened in 2011, which was 10 years ago. So this is a cautionary tale, though I don't want anyone to labor under the delusion that people don't want COVID vaccines. People want COVID vaccines. Okay, hopefully now we can segue to sort of a more uplifting discussion. Vaccine activism in the US in particular has taken many forms. There's been loads of direct action. I've been involved with some of it, so I'm happy to share that. These are two protests that took place in Boston/Cambridge over the past year. The one on the left-hand side is a picture of a bunch of Partners in Health doctors. The person photographed there is Dr. KJ Sun of Partners in Health. Outside of Stefan Gantz's home in Beacon Hill, they built this whole pile of bones to represent the number of people who had died through Moderna's sort of negligence during the COVID-19 pandemic and failure to act. And I think these doctors, many of whom are affiliated with Harvard Medical School, received a lot of flack for their actions, but continue to be very vocal about this issue. Flack from the medical school administration, which has very close ties to Moderna. Yeah. Yes. On the left-hand side, you can see a much larger rally that happened in Kendall Square in April. There were people from the DSA there, people from Prep for All, People's Vaccine Alliance. There were a few more groups that I'm forgetting, but that were certainly instrumental in organizing, sending out the call to action. And so I think this direct action is actually incredibly powerful, especially because in Boston, there are so many biotech firms that are like right here. I was actually pushing pretty hard at some of the planning meetings for this conference to schedule some kind of direct action event, but I'm very happy with the fact that we're all going to be going to Seaport tomorrow. I think that's very important. Okay. Also, you may recall earlier this year a stat article by a BU professor named Jeremy Menchik, who wrote about how he was dropping out of the Moderna vaccine trial, kind of out of protest of the fact that Moderna was enabling so much debt, so much senseless debt. And in the aftermath of this article, one of my colleagues at Harvard Medical School, Brent Even, kind of decided to drop out of the trial in solidarity. And then we thought, oh, maybe we should turn this into a mass movement. So we started mRNA Vaccines for All, which is right now it's a web page, but it's essentially a movement that trial participants can join. They can withdraw their participation from the Moderna phase 4 trial, which is still ongoing for the mRNA vaccine. The idea is that by withholding their information, perhaps we can pressure Moderna to act in a way that's more benevolent, to say. We've received a lot of criticism from various corners for doing this. I think it is certainly an ethically complicated thing. There are people who have told us that this movement is quite morally reprehensible. I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts. We can talk about that now or at the end.
Tell me what's morally reprehensible.
I think people think that denying information that would help establish the long-term safety profile of these vaccines that so many people received is quote-unquote morally reprehensible. To which you kind of respond, it's no one's obligation to join these trials, and they're perfectly within their right to drop out if they feel like the company is not using their information for the general good. But yeah, I think it's challenging. I think like any sort of form of direct action, there are people who completely do not agree with it.
What's the website?
mRNA4all.org. So mRNA4all. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone here is a Moderna trial participant, but I would encourage you to look into this if you are, or if you're not. And finally, something really, really interesting, but I don't think we talk about perhaps enough as sort of on the PHP side of things, is shareholder activism. So Oxfam, I mean, you can love Oxfam, you can hate Oxfam. I think many people in low and middle income countries always don't love Oxfam. But Oxfam did something really, really interesting, where they actually tried to push through a shareholder resolution at Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. They hold stock in all of these companies. And the resolution was to share the technology behind the COVID vaccine. So essentially trying to get these companies to engage in tech transfer. And they kind of began thinking about this resolution and put it out there in November of last year, and shareholders actually ended up voting on the resolution this past spring. And I think the votes, I think it was about 25% yes votes at both Moderna and Pfizer, which is not like a resounding success, but it is a substantial enough fraction of shareholders, I think, to galvanize Moderna to make some of those incremental changes that we were talking about, right? They did sort of update their patent pledge, right? They did pledge not to enforce their patent. They did decide to open this mRNA facility in Kenya. And so I think mobilizing shareholders is actually like a very underappreciated tool that we can exploit more in order to get these pharmaceutical companies to respond to the will of the people. Oxfam also filed this kind of bizarre SEC complaint against Moderna last year in December. They basically were whistleblowers. They claimed that the company had been publishing misleading statements and failing to disclose key information to shareholders. And I actually don't know what happened with that. So if anyone else knows, please do inform me. But basically, I want to leave you all with the following key points. What can we do as physicians and activists in the US side? We can invest, like literally invest, in low and middle-income country-based manufacturing efforts. We can amplify messaging from academic and civil society groups in low and middle-income countries. There's going to be a wave of activism around this December 17th TRIPS waiver decision for the therapeutics and diagnostics for COVID, and really sort of elevating the voices of people in civil society who are doing really amazing work on that will become crucial, right? Like social media is our friend. We have very sort of exalted and privileged positions in this world in many ways, and so I think it behooves us to use that to support the work that's being done in low and middle-income countries specifically. And we can mobilize shareholders of U.S. pharmaceutical companies. I think this is kind of a lever of power that we can push, again, in order to attain vaccine equity, but also to do other things, like to push the needle forward on our sort of single payer agenda, perhaps. We can engage in direct action. And finally, we can all commit to working towards a more just architecture for international medical countermeasure distribution. Because as nice as it would be if the COVID pandemic were the last pandemic, that's almost certainly not going to be true. I think someone here mentioned like increasing rates of zoonotic spillover into the population. And so basically this is going to happen again. But we simply can't screw up the way we've screwed up in the past 2 years. We can't let millions of people die because they don't have vaccines or diagnostics or therapies. And so I think it's all incumbent on us to reflect and figure out how we can collectively put together this framework for medical cooperation across borders, completely agnostic to country. So I would love to hear your thoughts on things I presented, on things I didn't present. I just feel like there's so much conversation we can have about these topics. And so, yeah, any questions, comments, discussion?
To your last point.
Yeah.
There is negotiations ongoing at the WHO on a pandemic treaty.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and U.S. is clearly going to be a key player in that. So, I'm not sure what the point of entry will be, but that's potentially going to be very important.
Yeah.
For future pandemics, what the treaty says and doesn't say.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It was like so good and so actionable, and I just like learned sort of.
I'm really glad.
Yeah, so thank you so much.
Of course.
So Vanessa and I are actually, we're like COVID crew at Stanford, so we like provide COVID vaccines. And up until now, they've been provided by the government. Most of the people that we vaccinate are uninsured. So this might be more of a California question, but it's open to anyone. But we're very worried about, like, I'm sure everyone is, the commercialization
Right.
of vaccines, and we're worried that our program's gonna have to stop operating because we're not gonna be able to afford like $130
Yeah.
doses of vaccines.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you know of any like vaccine advocacy work that's already happening in the US that we could join, or like any suggestions, I guess, on like how we could be proactive about thinking about this like very imminent problem.
That's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for you. I can certainly look into it and ask some of my colleagues who work on vaccine equity, but for whom that's their primary thing. Also, if anyone else in the crowd has ideas. The one thing, go ahead.
I don't know if a citizen gets involved in this, but I'm
Yes.
sure there are others.
Yeah, I think Public Citizen probably does have very good roadmaps for moving forward in these circumstances. The other thing I will say is that I think this is not a solution to your question, or to your problem, but I do think that this kind of reifies the need for, again, more competition in the COVID vaccine market in the US. And so advocating for foreign manufacturers to actually be allowed to bring their products to market in the US, most likely for like a much cheaper cost than the Pfizer and Moderna and Orange vaccines, I think will be super crucial to this, especially as we see more countries.
Two thoughts on this
Yeah.
question. Just sorry to bring it up.
Please.
UAM, Universities Allied for Central Medicines, that organization does a lot of activism work around ensure equitable distribution of medicines, including vaccines. And then Doctors for America has a FDA task force. Those folks too. It's mostly trying to ensure that when people are bringing medicines to trial, that the statistics are well done and like ensuring that like the right drugs come to market and don't just like ran through. This is sort of the other side where we need essential medicines coming through in an appropriate way too. But I think there's some great advocacy efforts at play here and things in that area. Yeah.
Yes.
Two quick points. One,
Sure.
well, one is just a response to something you just said. I don't think I would frame it as we need more competition in the market.
Sure.
I think rather it's the policy decision to allow one or two players to dominate, right?
Yeah.
I don't know
think
that
that's
competition is the solution.
Yeah.
I actually think, policy decisions may be able to influence things more than trying to let the free market solve it. So
Yeah, I
just
think
just to be careful in that frame.
that's a good point.
I guess the other point I would make, or the other question I would ask for you is just to circle back. Here we are at PNHP
Yes.
advocating for single payer. So
Yes.
so tie this directly into our fight for universal health care.
Yeah, so I think that a large portion of the fight for universal healthcare that maybe doesn't get talked about as much is intellectual property. I think that we talk a lot about how, like, if we are able to get to a place where we have a single payer system, then we'll have more bargaining power with drug companies and
Sure.
we'll be able to bring the prices of drugs down and whatever. But I think fundamentally the issue is that people are producing new technologies that are ostensibly to help the public and that are like putting all of these like locks on the ways that we can use them and the ways that we can share information. And I think a move towards, in general, more open source development of technology is something that's single payer agenda I think needs to really be fighting for. Which I think obviously involves like radically shaking up the way we think about pharmaceuticals in the US and the whole world. Everyone will say like there are no incentives to develop if there are no profits and no protection of intellectual property rights. And I guess I just like fundamentally don't agree with that. I think incentive to develop comes with necessity. Like if there are problems, people will be figuring out ways to solve those problems. And it's much less about like, how can we it should be much less about how we can profit off of the backs of people who have those problems and more about how can we make sure that we're like doing science and achieving sort of translation in a way that is, in a way that's super collaborative between thinkers all over the world and all over the US.
So then permit me to take this a step further then,
Yes,
because I think what I'm hearing you say is the fight for national health care, and I think we heard this earlier today, needs to move beyond just the payer,
Exactly.
right? We need to be thinking about where the places are that profiteering is happening
Exactly.
within the entire healthcare system, both in
Yes.
healthcare delivery and in the other things that are being delivered within
Exactly.
healthcare. And this is another example of a profiteering that single payer won't solve, but it is clearly driving both inequity and high cost within the healthcare system more broadly. So, okay.
I could not have put it better myself. Yes, please.
Just to stay with this question of increasing competition, allowing inputs. I see the potential for that aggravating the inequities. If we assume that there is some objective means of scoring efficacy of various products, I can see it turning out that the high efficacy ones are reserved for rich people in this country. They can afford to buy them, and the cheap ones are what everybody else gets.
That's true. Yeah.
That's a worry. And
Yeah.
until we have a way of sort of distributing stuff without the marketplace, without these being commodities.
Yeah.
That comes back to the fundamental.
Yeah.
Healthcare needs to be right, not
Yes.
not a consumer marketplace.
Absolutely. I agree, and I think that's totally fair. Yes.
Estimate of how much they gotta put into development. It's been a workout since
Yes.
I was one.
I should know this number, but I don't have enough to explain it. I can find it. Please.
This is totally off topic.
Oh,
I have very little experience with, say, vaccine hesitancy,
sure.
related to colonialism in the global south.
Yeah.
But in my limited experience in this country,
Yeah.
with African heritage people, there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy because of the history of racism
True.
in this.
Yes.
I'm very personally involved with one person who just can't get to vaccinate, even though she's sick and in her 70s.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely a pervasive issue for marginalized people, I think, around the world, and the US being part of the world is true there too. Yeah, I will say that I think sometimes conversations about vaccine hesitancy ignore the subterranean kind of structural factors that we just can't see. And I'll just give an example off the top of my head. So I also spent some time working with the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. And there's like very low vaccine penetrance in the homeless population in Boston. And nurses and physicians were really chalking it up to vaccine hesitancy, because what people would say was, I don't want to get the COVID vaccine, which sounds like, yeah, they don't want to get the COVID vaccine. But it turns out that oftentimes what people mean is, I don't want to experience the side effects of the COVID vaccine when I'm living on the street, right? Like that's completely reasonable. You don't want to be sick when you have to sleep outdoors every day. So I think sometimes this stuff can be a little blurry. Please, in the back.
Yeah, just along those lines, like a lot of the research on vaccine hesitancy has shown that like people do trust their doctors and they trust their local clinics to recommend vaccines, but they're just concerned about the side effects.
Exactly.
The long-term effects in all populations.
Yeah, that's really true.
I'm curious, when you're doing research for this, I remember a few decades ago, the antivirals were coming out and South Africa was getting decimated with HIV.
Yes.
Wasn't intellectual property the same argument why we couldn't share the antivirals with South Africa?
Yeah, I mean,
It was exactly the
I
same
do think it
argument.
was very much a replication of the same phenomenon, yeah.
And you know what's interesting? I heard this commentator on a podcast say that, these sci-fi movies where there's an alien going to attack, like Independence Day, and the whole world gets united.
Yeah.
But the COVID vaccine is a perfect example, right? It doesn't care what ethnic group or religion, it's going to wipe out humanity. And look what happens.
Yeah.
The complete opposite.
Right.
We're doomed.
Yes.
Yeah, just like thinking about the economic imperialism, I was wondering if you came across, like, is the World Bank involved in all all of that?
You know, my research did not extend to that, but I'm sure they have their fingers in the pie. But that's a good lead, and I should check in. Thanks. Yes.
I was just gonna say that, Adam Gaffney led a group of PNHP and Canadian people in producing a paper about restructuring the pharmaceutical system. It was published in DMJ in
2018.
May of 2018.
I'll take a look at that, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, yes.
I'm curious if there's any comparison historically between the vaccine rollout that we see today and the rollout that we saw 7 years ago. It's also the impact itself. And I don't how many vaccine disparities in people today, but it's part of the consolidation of trends.
I haven't seen very many comparative analyses between COVID and polio. I will say that the majority of the world is getting lots of vaccines, right? And very many countries have very strong vaccination campaigns for lots of diseases. I mean, BCG comes to mind. Like most people in low and middle income countries get the BCG vaccine, right? Like there's no issue. Like there are issues of like last mile problem and whatnot, but like it's not coming up to the same extent that it came up for COVID. I think part of that is again the cold chain issue, like mRNA technology being so finicky. But I think a large part of that is also that the people who are developing BCG vaccine, right, or who are manufacturing it are in low and middle income countries because tuberculosis is a disease that primarily affects people in low income countries, right? Suddenly, when the incentives shift and it's pharmaceutical companies who are making a disease that also affects high income population, making vaccines for a disease that also affects high income populations, that's when you start seeing, oh, we're not able to get vaccines to everyone in low income countries.
Well, you can't understate the role that disinformation campaigns and politicization of the vaccines has played in opening that up.
Yes.
For this is that.
Yeah, that didn't happen until COVID.
I live in the laws. Many people who do these philosophical things, I still believe I'm curious about just that is an enormous leap today. I don't know what sort of abuse jump that could be.
Yeah.
Black chocolate. But I'm sure that, that can't people up.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is that something that idea, well, they don't want it, that's why we're not working on it. I'm taking it for myself to say.
Yeah.
Is that just, is that the real problem? People are.
Right. Yeah, so I will say that I think the US has done a very good job of exporting vaccine hesitancy. Even though it hasn't exported very many vaccines. I was recently talking to Dr. Stanley Jewett, who is director of the Haiti CDC, or this branch of the CDC that works in Haiti, I should say. And he was mentioning to me that a lot of patients, even though COVID has devastated Haiti, a lot of patients have not realized the extent to which they themselves are being affected by COVID. And a large part of that is because everyone's talking about COVID, like in the media, as though it's not a disease that affects low income people. Like the risk perception in a lot of these countries, which often fuels vaccine uptake, is completely skewed. Yeah.
I really like your point about mobilizing shareholders and thinking about it in a different way and using the levers of power that we have available to us. 2 questions. I'm wondering if American universities are significant shareholders of US pharmaceutical companies. And I'm also wondering if you see any ties between the labor movement that we've been talking about over the last couple of days and this sort of work.
I think I don't know much about labor ties. As for academic sort of investment in pharmaceutical companies, I think it's probably honestly pretty rare to find direct academic investors in pharma. But I think what is all too common is you get these like biotech startups that spin out of medical universities, and then there like are very close connections moving forward between administrators and those startups, which may burgeon into huge biotech companies, as we see with Harvard, MIT, and Moderna. And so I think that is really like a lever that we can learn to press better, right? Like, how do we convince academics, scientists who are in this like highly isolated, it feels isolated, it feels like an isolated ecosystem, but actually it has all these ties and tendrils going out into industry that people just like don't want to acknowledge really. How do we make those ties more apparent and use them for our purposes? I think that's like it's a really good point and something we all need to think about. I think, yeah, maybe the last comment or we're out of time.
There are ties, but the ties are often in licensing, either
Yes.
IP or products.
Yes.
And tech transfer.
Yeah.
I mean, universities can get hundreds of millions of dollars from licensing out
Yes.
highly profitable technology or
Yes.
IP.
Yes. And I'll add to that that I think something we definitely saw during the development of vaccines here in the US for COVID was universities not only licensing technologies, but like university labs running clinical trials of these vaccines and also therapeutics, right? So I think there's all of these ways in which academia and industry are kind of enmeshed, and disentangling them, I think, would be.
And that's what's really in the article that Joel mentioned. Part of that is the proposal that drug development be divorced from profit industry and come back, instead of having to spin off to a company in order to go from preclinical to phase 1, 2, and 3. We take all of that back within the government so that we can separate out and make it, because we're not going to profiteer as the we being the public or the government.
Yeah.
That's a component of that argument.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. We got a little over, but thank you all so much.